Greetings, Fort to Port family, friends, and fans. What do you get when you mix 1 part glacier with 1 part meltwater, a little bit of clay sprinkled in, some sand, and some rotted leaves? You get the Great Black Swamp. And that's what we're going to be taking a look at today, the Great Black Swamp here in Northwest Ohio. You know, driving around Northwest Ohio myself, we sometimes might take for granted or not even really think about, why are all these agricultural fields out here? Well, there's a reason for that. It has to do with the land, the geography, and of course, the prior history to all those farm fields that you see. Let's take a closer look today in this episode of Fort to Port Histories. The Great Black Swamp, also known simply as the Black Swamp, was a glacially fed wetland in northwest Ohio and northeast Indiana that existed from the end of the Wisconsin glaciation until the late 19th century. Made up of extensive swamps and marshes with some higher and drier ground, the swamp occupied what was formerly the southwestern part of proglacial Lake Maumee, a prior lake to Lake Erie. So don't get it confused. There was Lake Maumee first, and then Lake Erie. The area was about 25 miles wide, north to south, and 100 miles long, covering an estimated 1,500 square miles. This place was huge. The first inhabitants of the swamp were indigenous natives who lived along the banks of the rivers and coastlines of Lake Erie. We'll be focusing on the natives of Northwest Ohio in our next video. We're not going to skip over them. Gradually, the swamp was drained and settled in the second half of the 19th century, making it highly productive farmland. The land once covered by the swamp lies primarily within the Maumee River and Portage River watersheds in northwest Ohio and northeast Indiana. The boundary was determined primarily by ancient sandy beach ridges formed on the shores of Lake Maumee after a glacial retreat several thousand years ago. The swamp stretched roughly from Fort Wayne, Indiana, eastward to the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, which sits along the Lake Erie shore, and from roughly US 6 south to Findlay. Near its southern edge, at the southwestern corner of present-day Auglaize County, wheeled transportation was nearly impossible during most of the year, and local residents thought the rigors of travel to be unsuitable for anyone except adult men. Sorry, ladies. The vast swamp was a network of forests, wetlands, and grasslands. In the lowest, flattest areas prone to permanent inundation, deciduous swamp forests predominated and were characterized by species of ash, elm, cottonwood, and sycamore. In slightly higher areas, with some topographical relief and better drainage, beech, maples, and basswood trees were common, and of course additional species were dominant as well. On elevated beach ridges and moraines with good to excessive drainage, other species like oak and hickory were also very common. The area contained non-forested wetlands, particularly marshes and wet prairies as well, with marshes being particularly extensive along the Lake Erie shoreline east of Toledo, Ohio. Wild animals were abundant in the swamp, and in the early days you could have found beaver, mink, muskrat, fox, and even a smaller version of bison. That's right, bison like we think of, out in the Great Plains. Yes, they were here. White-tailed deer, raccoon, rabbit, squirrel. That smaller game was also abundant as well. Freshwater fish in rivers and streams filled the area in the waterways, including bass, carp, and bluegill. Although much of the area to the east, south, and north was settled in the early 19th century, the dense habitat and difficulty of travel through the swamp delayed its development by several decades. An early road from modern-day Fremont, Ohio to Perrysburg, Ohio was constructed through the Maumee Roadlands in 1825 to 1827 and was overlaid with gravel in 1838. Travel in the wet season could still take days or even weeks. The impassability of the swamp was an obstacle during the so-called Toledo War of 1835 to 1836. Unable to traverse the swamp, the Michigan and Ohio militias never came to battle. That's right, Michigan and Ohio, we've been fighting way before the dreaded football team rivalry. Settlement of the region was also inhibited by an epidemic called malaria. The disease was a chronic problem for residents of the region until the area was drained and the former mosquito breeding grounds were all dried up. So if you think mosquitoes are like a problem now along the Maumee River, you haven't seen anything. These mosquitoes were like so big back then, they could like pick you up and carry you away. Well, I mean, not really, but like kind of. They could kill you. In the 1850s, the states began an organized attempt to drain the swamp for agricultural use and ease of travel. Various projects were undertaken over a 40-year period. Bowling Green, Ohio resident James B. Hill expedited draining the swamp areas with his Buckeye traction ditcher. Hill's ditching machine laid drainage tiles at a record pace. The area was largely drained and settled over the next 3 decades. The development of the Miami-Erie Canal, railroads, and a local drainage tile industry are thought to have contributed greatly to drainage and settlement of the Great Black Swamp. During the 2000s, there have been efforts to preserve and restore portions of the swamp to its pre-settlement state. After the excessive spread of harmful algae blooms in nearby western Lake Erie returned in 2011, and every year since, there has been renewed interest in restoring wetlands in the drained Great Black Swamp region. Some have even called for the restoration and creation of treatment wetlands in the former Black Swamp area to help reduce phosphorus inflow from the polluted Maumee River to Lake Erie. The sandy region of western Lucas County, known as Oak Openings, looks very different today than it did in the 1800s. Much of Metro Parks land management today works to focus on preserving what's unique about this rare and special region in northwest Ohio that is home to more rare and endangered species than anywhere else in the state of Ohio. Picture the landscape in the early 1800s, sand heaped into dunes, with spreading oak trees interspersed with prairie grasses and wildflowers. Between the dunes were wetlands where water stood knee-deep on top of rich, mucky soil. The early settlers dubbed this area the Oak Openings because the trees were spaced so far apart they could drive a wagon through the woods in any direction. Oak Openings Preserve Metro Park was named for this unique region in northwest Ohio, a region that harbored diverse landscapes of rare plants and animals, and today is still available for your enjoyment. Its walking trails, its paved paths, its stone-crushed graveled paths, bridges, and other areas provide a beautiful and breathtaking look back at the Great Black Swamp. The history of the Great Black Swamp is a fascinating one, and not something we can cover in a 5 to 10 minute video. In our upcoming episodes, we're going to take a closer look at the indigenous cultures that once called the Great Black Swamp home. We're also going to take a look at the first settlers who came into the Black Swamp, cut the trees, cleared them, and helped to turn northwest Ohio into a lucrative farming community. From that, as you drive around and you see those cornfields out your car windows, remember as you pass them by, the corn grows so well here in northwest Ohio for one reason, and that's because of the Great Black Swamp. From the swamp, we were able to turn this area, our ancestors, into one of the most lucrative areas for agriculture in all of the Midwest. Thanks for watching Port to Port Histories. I'm Taylor Moyer. Make sure you like, subscribe, you do all that stuff that everybody wants you to do on social media, and we hope to see you coming back. Thank you.